Tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from and at what time, so I can get to know you better. To support the channel for free, don't forget to subscribe and like the video. There are names that echo through history, whispered with a mixture of awe and dread. There are places on our planet that are frozen in time, monuments to a moment when everything changed. On April 26, 1986, in a city built as a testament to Soviet atomic ambition, both a name and a place were forged in fire and radiation: Chernobyl. It was the site of the worst nuclear disaster in the history of humankind. A catastrophe born from a cascade of human error, flawed design, and a suffocating culture of secrecy. What happens when our reach exceeds our grasp? When a safety test designed to protect life becomes the very trigger for its widespread destruction. Join us as we journey back to the final hours of the city of Pripyat and uncover the story of the explosion that sent a radioactive cloud across the globe, leaving a scar on the earth that will last for millennia. In the sprawling forests of northern Ukraine, nestled by a placid river, stood a city born of a dream. This was Pripyat, a testament to the Soviet Union's atomic ambition. Founded in 1970, it was an Atomgrad, a city built exclusively to serve the colossal V.I. Lenin nuclear power plant just 3 kilometers away. But it was more than just a dormitory town. It was a worker's paradise, a vision of the communist future made manifest. Unlike the gray, crumbling cities elsewhere in the Soviet Empire, Pripyat was vibrant and modern. Its wide, clean boulevards were lined with new apartment blocks, housing nearly 50,000 people. The average age was just 26. The city echoed with the sounds of its 15 primary schools and the laughter of its thousands of children. For its residents, life was good, privileged even. The shops were stocked with goods that were luxuries in Moscow or Kiev. There were cafes, a grand palace of culture, a pristine sports stadium, and a state-of-the-art swimming pool that would become an icon of its abandonment. Above all, there was a profound sense of optimism. The residents were pioneers on the frontier of science. They were taming the atom for the good of mankind, providing clean, limitless energy to the Republic. The 4 giant reactors of the Chernobyl plant, looming on the horizon, were not a source of fear, but of immense pride. They represented security, prosperity, and the technological supremacy of the Soviet system. The atom was their servant, a powerful but docile giant that had gifted them this idyllic life. In the city's amusement park, a bright yellow Ferris wheel was assembled, ready for its grand opening for the upcoming May Day celebrations. It stood as a silent promise of more joy to come, a symbol of a future that seemed as bright and limitless as the power churning away in the heart of the nearby reactor. This was Pripyat in April 1986, a young, hopeful, atomic paradise, blissfully unaware that it was living on borrowed time, a modern utopia perched on the very edge of the abyss. The heart of Pripyat's prosperity and the instrument of its doom was the RBMK 1000 reactor. A uniquely Soviet design, it was a behemoth of graphite and steel, a product of the Cold War's dual demands for immense power and weapons-grade plutonium. This dual purpose was the genesis of its fatal flaws. Unlike Western reactors, which used water as both a coolant and a moderator to slow down neutrons, the RBMK used water for cooling, but a massive 1,700-ton core of graphite as its moderator. This design choice created a terrifyingly unstable characteristic known as a positive void coefficient. In simple terms, if the reactor began to overheat and the cooling water turned to steam, the nuclear reaction would not slow down as it would in other designs. Instead, the steam voids would cause the reaction to accelerate, creating more heat, which created more steam, in a catastrophic feedback loop that could spiral out of control in seconds. The designers were aware of this dangerous trait, but it was considered a manageable, low-probability risk. This hubris was compounded by another, even more critical design flaw hidden within the reactor's control system. The control rods, made of neutron-absorbing boron carbide, were designed to be inserted into the core to slow or stop the reaction. However, to save costs, their tips were made of graphite. This meant that when the rods were first inserted into the core, these graphite tips would momentarily displace water and dramatically increase the reaction rate before the boron carbide could begin to slow it down. It was a shutdown system that, under the wrong conditions, could function as a detonator. To complete this trifecta of danger, the entire colossal structure lacked a proper containment building. Western reactors were encased in thick, steel-reinforced concrete domes designed to contain any release of radioactive material. The RBMK 1000 had only a partial confinement structure, woefully inadequate for containing a major explosion. It was a machine built with immense power, but also with a shocking disregard for safety, a ticking time bomb of graphite and uranium. On the night of April 25, 1986, the crew of Chernobyl's Reactor No. 4 was preparing for a seemingly routine safety test. The goal was to determine if, in the event of a total power failure, the plant's spinning turbines could generate enough residual electricity to power the emergency water cooling pumps until the backup diesel generators kicked in. It was a crucial safety question, but the execution of the test would be a cascade of human error, violated protocols, and disastrous timing. The test was originally scheduled for the afternoon to be overseen by the experienced day shift. However, a regional power dispatcher ordered the plant to delay the procedure and keep supplying electricity to the grid. This single decision had profound consequences. The test was pushed back by over 10 hours into the graveyard shift, a crew with far less experience operating the reactor under such unusual conditions. This long delay at low power had a chemical effect on the reactor core, a process known as xenon poisoning. The buildup of the isotope xenon-135 acted like a brake on the nuclear reaction, making the reactor sluggish and difficult to manage. To counteract this and raise the power back to the level required for the test, the operators made a fateful decision. They began pulling control rods out of the core, far beyond the minimum number mandated by safety regulations. They were essentially removing the reactor's brakes to get it up to speed. To compound the danger, they disabled a series of critical automatic safety systems, including the emergency core cooling system, fearing they might interfere with the test's parameters. They were now flying a deeply unstable machine, blind. The operators, led by the ambitious and headstrong Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov, were under immense pressure to complete the test. They pushed forward, ignoring warning signs and overriding the reactor's own attempts to shut itself down. The delicate balance of power inside the RBMK was gone. The system was now primed for disaster, a volatile cocktail of design flaws and reckless human intervention, waiting for a single spark to ignite it. At 1:23 a.m. on April 26th, the test officially began. The steam to the turbine was shut off. As the turbine began to slow, the power to the cooling pumps decreased, and the temperature inside the reactor core began to rise. Within seconds, the situation escalated beyond anyone's control. Alarms screamed across the control room as operators watched in horror as the power level began to surge uncontrollably. The positive void coefficient, the reactor's fatal flaw, had taken over. The increasing steam in the core was now accelerating the nuclear reaction at an exponential rate. At 1:23:40, the shift foreman, Alexander Akimov, made the only decision he had left. He pressed the AZ-5 button, initiating an emergency shutdown, or scram. It was the ultimate failsafe, designed to plunge all 2-on-1 control rods into the core and immediately halt the fission process. It was an act meant to save them. Instead, it sealed their fate. As the control rods began their descent, their graphite tips entered the core first. This displaced the remaining water coolant, causing an immediate and catastrophic power spike. In the lower part of the core, the energy output skyrocketed to over 100 times the reactor's nominal output. The surge was so immense that it ruptured the fuel channels and jammed the control rods, leaving them stuck only a third of the way in. A series of thunderous reports echoed from the reactor hall. The first was a massive steam explosion, which blew the 2,000-ton steel lid, known as the biological shield, clean off the reactor. Seconds later, a second, more powerful explosion, a mixture of hydrogen and combustible gases, tore the reactor building apart, ejecting a plume of superheated, intensely radioactive graphite and nuclear fuel into the night sky. In the control room, the operators were thrown from their feet, the air filled with dust and a strange metallic taste. They stared at their instruments, which read off the scale, refusing to believe the truth. They didn't know it yet, but they had just witnessed the heart of the atom tear itself open, unleashing a hell on Earth that would poison the land for centuries. In the immediate hellish aftermath of the explosion, the heart of reactor number 4 was no longer contained. It was a gaping wound torn into the fabric of the night, a gateway to a force man had unleashed but could no longer control. From this chasm, a breathtakingly beautiful, yet terrifyingly lethal column of light ascended into the sky. It was a serene, ethereal blue, a mesmerizing spectacle that would later be identified as the visible signature of Cherenkov radiation, the glow of air itself being ionized by an unimaginable torrent of radioactive particles. This was the azure serpent, uncoiling from its concrete cage and breathing death into the atmosphere. The very air around the ruined reactor had a sharp, metallic taste, a phantom sensation of ozone that was, in reality, the taste of atoms being ripped apart. The first firefighters to arrive on the scene, men like Vladimir Pravik and his crew, saw only a fire. A massive, industrial fire, the kind they had trained for, but a fire nonetheless. They were utterly unaware that they were not running towards a blaze, but into the core of an unshielded nuclear reactor. The ground was littered with chunks of what they assumed was debris. In reality, it was graphite from the reactor's moderator, now burning at thousands of degrees and spewing isotopes with ferocious intensity. Every piece was a lethal shard, emitting doses of radiation that could kill a person in minutes. The sheer physics of the event were staggering. The biological shield, a 2,000-ton steel and concrete lid known as Elena, had been blasted upwards, flipping through the air like a coin before crashing back into the reactor vessel at an angle, leaving the core wide open to the sky. The initial silence of the Pripyat night had been replaced by the roar of the inferno and the groaning of twisted steel. This was not merely an accident. It was an apocalypse in miniature, a star brought to Earth, the azure serpent, a silent, beautiful predator, had been born. Its hypnotic glow was a siren's call, luring the brave and the unsuspecting to their doom, its venomous breath destined to poison the land for millennia. While heroes were unknowingly sacrificing their lives amidst the radioactive flames, the nearby city of Pripyat began to stir. Awakened by the percussive boom that had shaken their apartment blocks, residents looked out their windows to see the strange, colorful display in the distance. Word spread quickly through the model Soviet city. There was a fire at the plant. But this was no ordinary fire. It was a spectacle, a morbid curiosity mixed with the naive sense of security that the atomic age had fostered, drew people from their homes. A railway bridge located about 2 kilometers from the reactor offered a perfect, unobstructed view. It became an impromptu gathering spot, a theater for the unfolding catastrophe. Families assembled, some with young children wrapped in blankets against the late April chill. They pointed and stared, mesmerized by the pillar of otherworldly blue light and the rainbow-hued flames dancing above the reactor building. They were watching their own doom, and they had no idea. The wind that night blew from the south, carrying a concentrated, invisible plume of radioactive dust, fission products, and gases directly over the bridge. It swirled around the spectators, settling on their clothes, their hair, and in their lungs. The children tasted metal in the air and marveled at the pretty colors, while their parents chatted, speculating about the cause. They were being showered with alpha, beta, and gamma radiation at a rate that defied comprehension. In that moment, they were among the most irradiated people on the planet. This location would later earn a grim and infamous name: the Bridge of Death. While stories claiming that every single person who stood there that night perished are likely an exaggeration, there is no doubt that they all received horrific, life-altering, and in many cases, fatal doses of radiation. They were the first civilian witnesses to a nuclear Armageddon, their curiosity sealing their fate. They stood on that concrete precipice, watching a beautiful fire, completely oblivious to the silent, invisible enemy that was invading their bodies and rewriting their futures in the most tragic way imaginable. As the radioactive serpent writhed over Pripyat, another, more insidious force was at work hundreds of kilometers away in Moscow: the machinery of the Soviet state. The core tenets of the system, secrecy, control of information, and the projection of infallible power, collided head-on with the physical reality of a nuclear core meltdown. The result was a wall of silence, a deliberate and deadly denial that would cost countless lives. The initial reports that reached the Kremlin were fragmented, confusing, and systematically downplayed by local officials, terrified of reporting the full truth. To General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev and the Politburo, the event was initially framed as a fire and a minor accident, not a catastrophic explosion that had vaporized a reactor. In a system where bad news was a career-ending offense, the truth struggled to ascend the chain of command. While firefighters were vomiting from acute radiation sickness and the reactor core burned freely, the state's first priority was not public safety, but information control. Phone lines to and from Pripyat were severed to prevent news from spreading. The city was quietly sealed off by the militia, trapping its 50,000 residents in a highly contaminated zone. The denial was absolute. On the morning of April 26th, as doctors in Pripyat's hospital were witnessing the horrific effects of radiation on the first responders, Soviet news programs made no mention of any incident. Life across the vast empire continued as normal. The state's decision to conceal the truth had its most horrifying consequences in the surrounding regions. In Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, just 130 kilometers to the south, preparations were in full swing for the upcoming May Day parade. Children rehearsed in schoolyards, and citizens went about their daily lives, breathing in air that was becoming increasingly toxic. The government, fully aware of a major incident but refusing to grasp its scale, said nothing. This wall of silence was more than just a political maneuver. It was a weapon of mass destruction in its own right, allowing the invisible enemy to advance unopposed, claiming silent victims who never even knew they were in a war. The Kremlin's wall of silence could contain information, but it could not contain the laws of meteorology and physics. High in the atmosphere, the radioactive plume from Reactor 4 began a silent, inexorable journey, carried northwest by the prevailing winds. The invisible enemy did not respect borders or ideologies. Its first calling card would appear not in a Soviet city, but in the clean, orderly environment of a Swedish nuclear power plant. On the morning of Monday, April 28th, more than 2 days after the explosion, a technician at the Forsmark nuclear power plant, over 1,100 kilometers from Chernobyl, triggered a radiation alarm on his way into work. Panic ensued. The immediate assumption was a leak at their own facility. The plant was evacuated, and a frantic search for the source began. But they found nothing. The plant was secure. As more workers triggered the alarms, the plant's scientists began analyzing the radioactive particles found on their shoes. The isotopic fingerprint was damning. The particles, including isotopes like iodine-131 and cesium-137, were characteristic of a nuclear reactor accident, specifically a Soviet-designed RBMK reactor. The Swedes checked the wind patterns, and the data pointed unequivocally southeast toward the Soviet Union. The secret was out, betrayed by the wind itself. Sweden's nuclear authorities immediately tried to contact their Soviet counterparts, but were met with denial and silence. Frustrated and alarmed, they decided to go public. Soon, monitoring stations across Scandinavia and then Western Europe began reporting similarly anomalous radiation levels. Finland, Norway, and Denmark all detected the cloud. The invisible enemy had now manifested on the instruments of the entire continent. The international pressure on Moscow became unbearable. The Soviet Union could no longer pretend that nothing had happened. On the evening of April 28th, the state-run news program, Vremya, broadcast a terse 20-second statement from the Council of Ministers. It acknowledged that an accident had occurred at the Chernobyl power station, that one of the reactors was damaged, and that measures were being taken. It was a stunning, albeit heavily sanitized, admission. The wall of silence had been breached, not by spies or dissidents, but by the irrefutable evidence of science. Tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from and at what time, so I can get to know you better. To support the channel for free, don't forget to subscribe and like the video. The morning of Saturday, April 26, 1986, dawned in Pripyat like any other. Children walked to school, adults went about their weekend chores, and the city's 49,000 residents breathed in the spring air, completely unaware that they were inhaling poison. A few kilometers away, the exposed core of reactor number 4 was burning at over 2,000 degrees Celsius, spewing a plume of radioactive isotopes directly into the atmosphere. The authorities in Moscow knew the gravity of the situation, yet a blanket of silence was imposed. For 36 agonizing hours, the people of Pripyat lived, played, and even celebrated. 17 weddings took place that Saturday, under a cloud of lethal radiation. Some noticed a strange metallic taste in the air, or a peculiar tingling on their skin. Firefighters returning from the plant were horribly ill, their bodies burned by an invisible fire. Yet the official word was that everything was under control. It wasn't until Sunday afternoon, a day and a half after the explosion, that the truth could no longer be contained. At 2 p.m., a terse announcement was broadcast over local radio. It spoke of an unsatisfactory radioactive situation and a temporary evacuation. Residents were given just 2 hours to prepare. They were told to pack only essential documents, a change of clothes, and some food, as they would be returning in 3 days. This was a calculated deception to prevent panic. As over 1,000 buses streamed into the city, a scene of quiet chaos unfolded. Families packed frantically, forced to make impossible choices. Pets were left behind, their cries echoing in the empty apartments, a haunting testament to the city's sudden demise. By 5 p.m., a massive column of buses snaked its way out of Pripyat, leaving behind a ghost town. The citizens looked back at their homes, their possessions, their entire lives, believing they would soon return. They were wrong. They had just experienced their last day in a city that would be sealed off from the world, a permanent monument to a nuclear catastrophe. With the fire at Reactor 4 still raging and radioactive material blanketing the landscape, the Soviet Union initiated one of the largest and most desperate mobilization efforts in history. They needed an army to fight an invisible war, and so the call went out for liquidators. This was the official term for the civil and military personnel recruited to deal with the consequences of the disaster. Over the next 4 years, more than 600,000 people from every corner of the Soviet Empire would be conscripted or would volunteer for this duty. They were not just soldiers. They were miners, engineers, construction workers, doctors, scientists, and drivers. They were told they were saving their motherland, and indeed, they were saving a continent. Their task was monumental: to contain the uncontainable. They flew helicopters directly over the melting core, dropping sand, lead, and boron to smother the flames, a process that exposed the pilots to terrifying levels of radiation. On the ground, they scraped away and buried tons of contaminated topsoil, felled entire forests, and hosed down buildings with decontaminating liquids. They were a human shield, placed between a melting nuclear reactor and the rest of the world. The protective gear they were given was tragically inadequate. Many worked in simple cloth uniforms and face masks, or wore hastily fashioned lead aprons that offered little real protection against the gamma radiation piercing their bodies. They were armed with shovels and courage against an enemy they could not see, hear, or feel, but which was silently rewriting their cellular code. They worked in shifts, with their time in the most contaminated areas, the zone, strictly limited. But the doses they absorbed were still immense. In those first weeks and months, These men performed acts of incredible bravery, driven by a sense of duty and a profound understanding of the stakes. They succeeded in containing the initial disaster, but for tens of thousands of them, it was a victory that came at the cost of their own health, a sacrifice that would unfold slowly and painfully over the years to come. In the chaotic days following the explosion, Soviet scientists identified a new and even more terrifying threat. The molten core, a radioactive lava known as corium, was slowly melting through the concrete floor beneath the reactor. Directly below this floor lay the bubbler pools, massive reservoirs containing thousands of tons of water used as a coolant system for the plant. If this white-hot corium reached the water, it would trigger a thermal explosion of cataclysmic proportions. The resulting blast, estimated to be between 3 and 5 megatons, would have vaporized the entire plant, including the 3 other reactors, sending a plume of radioactive fallout across Europe and Asia, rendering much of the continent uninhabitable for centuries. A plan was hatched, as desperate as it was heroic. The water had to be drained, but the valves were located in a flooded, pitch-black, and lethally radioactive basement. 3 men volunteered for what was unequivocally a suicide mission. Engineers Alexei Ananenko and Valery Bespalov, and shift supervisor Boris Baranov. Equipped with wetsuits and dosimeters, they plunged into the darkness, wading through contaminated water, their flashlights cutting feeble beams through the toxic gloom. They knew the layout of the labyrinthine corridors, and against all odds found and opened the crucial valves, allowing the water to drain. They emerged as heroes, having prevented a second, far deadlier Chernobyl. But the danger wasn't over. To prevent the corium from melting into the groundwater, a second monumental effort was required. A call was made to the coal miners of Tula. Their mission, to dig a 150-meter tunnel beneath the reactor foundation and excavate a large chamber for a heat-exchanging device. For over a month, they worked around the clock in 50 degrees Celsius heat and high radiation, often stripping off their clothes and masks to breathe, digging with nothing but shovels. They were a force of nature against a nuclear meltdown, burrowing beneath a dying atomic heart to save the world above. Of all the contaminated areas at Chernobyl, none was more dangerous than the roof of the adjacent reactor number 3. The initial explosion had blasted over 100 tons of the reactor's core onto it, littering the surface with chunks of uranium fuel and highly radioactive graphite moderators. The radiation levels were astronomical, in some places reaching 10,000 roentgens per hour, a dose that would be fatal in a matter of minutes. Clearing this roof was critical to building the sarcophagus that would entomb the destroyed reactor. Initially, the Soviets turned to technology. They deployed sophisticated remote-controlled robots, including a West German machine named Joker. But the intense gamma radiation was something their designers had never anticipated. It fried the electronic circuits, rendering the multi-million-dollar machines useless. With technology defeated, the authorities turned to the most expendable and reliable tool they had: human beings. They were given the chillingly futuristic name biorobots. Young soldiers and reservists, most in their early 20s, were tasked with the cleanup. They were fitted with crude, heavy lead suits weighing up to 30 kilograms, which offered only minimal protection. Their mission was a mad dash into an invisible hell. In groups, they would run onto the roof, perform a single task, kicking a block of graphite or heaving one shovelful of debris over the edge into the reactor's crater, and then run back. Each sortie was timed to last no more than 90 seconds, and in some cases as little as 40, to limit their exposure to a permissible lifetime dose. After their single run, their job was done. They would never be sent back. Over 3,800 men were sent onto that roof. General Nikolai Tarakhanov would brief them, telling them they were heroes before sending them out. When they returned, he would praise them, and they would be awarded a certificate and a bonus of 100 rubles. It was a small price for a task that had irrevocably altered their bodies, a heroic, desperate, and brutal solution to a problem that technology could not solve. Aurelian's victory was not yet absolute. Though the queen was in chains, the spirit of her rebellion, a dangerously potent idea of Eastern independence, still radiated across the provinces. While the emperor was marching his prize back towards Europe, word arrived of a new, desperate uprising in Palmyra. The city that had surrendered so meekly had, in a final spasm of defiance, slaughtered the small Roman garrison left to occupy it. For Aurelian, this was the ultimate betrayal. His initial policy of clemency had been mistaken for weakness. Now the monster of rebellion, which he thought he had captured, had to be entombed for good. He turned his legions around, his march now fueled by cold fury. There would be no terms, no negotiations. The return to Palmyra was not a campaign. It was an act of extermination. The city's defenses, formidable as they were, could not withstand the focused wrath of a vengeful emperor and his battle-hardened troops. This time, the gates were not opened. They were shattered. What followed was the methodical and brutal construction of a sarcophagus made of fear and rubble. Aurelian unleashed his soldiers upon the city, sanctioning a wave of plunder and destruction that would silence Palmyra forever. The city's vast wealth, accumulated over centuries of trade, was systematically stripped. Its magnificent colonnades were toppled, its temples desecrated, and its people were put to the sword without distinction. The great temple of Bel, the very heart of Palmyrene spiritual life, was pillaged. The act was symbolic, a declaration that the gods of Palmyra were powerless before the might of Rome. Aurelian was not just conquering a city, he was killing an idea, burying it under the weight of its own ruins, so that it could never again contaminate the stability of the Roman world. The once vibrant oasis, the bride of the desert, was being sealed within a tomb of its own making, its revolutionary spirit contained at last. The physical destruction of Palmyra was only the beginning of the great unraveling. The true cost of Zenobia's war against Rome was measured in the lives, culture, and prosperity that vanished in its wake. The immediate human toll was catastrophic. The sacking of the city was not a clean surgical strike. It was a massacre that extinguished a significant portion of the population, from the ruling elite to the common artisan. The survivors were scattered, becoming refugees in the very desert their ancestors had mastered. This diaspora marked the end of the unique Palmyrene culture, a rich fusion of Greco-Roman, Persian, and Semitic traditions. The city's famous trade routes, the arteries that had pumped wealth into its heart for generations, now bled out. With Palmyra broken, the caravans that once journeyed from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean coast sought new, safer paths, bypassing the ruins. The economic engine of the East had seized, and a sickness of despair settled over the region. Perhaps the most poignant loss was the execution of Cassius Longinus, Zenobia's chief advisor. A man hailed as a living library and a walking museum. Longinus was one of the most brilliant Neoplatonist philosophers of his age. He was the intellectual architect of Zenobia's imperial ambitions, the voice that had counseled defiance. Aurelian, seeing him as the prime instigator of the rebellion, had him executed without hesitation. His death represented more than the loss of one man. It was the silencing of a world of knowledge, the burning of a library of thought that had flourished under Zenobia's patronage. The legacy of Zenobia's reign was thus a duality of immense pride and profound tragedy. She had shown the world what an Eastern empire could be, but its fall left a vacuum of power, a scar on the landscape, and a deep, lingering sense of loss for a golden age that had burned so brightly and so briefly. In the city of Emesa, the stage was set for the final act of Zenobia's reign. It was not a battlefield, but a tribunal. Before a victorious Aurelian, surrounded by his generals and the baying legions who demanded her death, Zenobia was brought forth to answer for her rebellion. This was her trial, a moment of ultimate reckoning, where the fate of the woman who called herself Augusta would be decided. The pressure was immense. The soldiers, having lost comrades in the hard-fought campaign, saw her as the sole cause of their suffering and roared for her execution. Aurelian, ever the pragmatist, knew that killing her might make her a martyr, a symbol for future rebellions. He needed more than her defeat. He needed her submission, her humiliation. He questioned her directly, demanding to know how she, a woman, had dared to challenge the authority of the Roman emperors. It is here that the historical accounts diverge, painting a complex and controversial portrait of the Queen's final stand. According to the historian Zosimus, a source often critical of Zenobia, the Queen, in a desperate bid to save her own life, faltered. Faced with the immediate threat of death, she allegedly deflected responsibility, placing the blame squarely on her advisors. She claimed that men like Cassius Longinus had filled her head with ambitions, persuading her to pursue a war she could not win. In this telling, she found her scapegoat. Whether this account is the unvarnished truth or a piece of Roman propaganda designed to diminish her stature is a matter of intense debate. But its effect was decisive. Aurelian, perhaps seeing a path to justify both mercy for her and severity for others, accepted her defense. The life of the Queen was spared, but the price was the honor of her most loyal counselors. Longinus and the others were condemned. The trial was over. Zenobia had survived. But for many, the Queen, who had defied an empire, had, in the end, betrayed her own court. With its spirit broken and its walls breached, Palmyra became a shadow of its former self. Rome transformed the vibrant metropolis into little more than a fortified military outpost, a frontier garrison for the Legio for Illyricum. It was now an exclusion zone, deliberately cut off from the main currents of trade and influence it once commanded. The great city, which had been a bridge between East and West, was now just a remote bastion, a monument to a failed rebellion. The desert, which the Palmyrines had so masterfully tamed, began its slow, inexorable process of reclamation. Sand drifted over the once bustling avenues and piled against the bases of fallen columns. Nature was asserting its dominance over the ambitions of humanity. But while Palmyra faded into a beautiful, desolate ruin, an unlikely resurgence was taking place hundreds of miles away, in the very heart of the empire that had crushed it. Zenobia was not executed. Aurelian, a master of political theater, understood that a living, defeated queen was a far more powerful symbol of Roman supremacy than a dead martyr. She was paraded through the streets of Rome in golden chains during his magnificent triumph of 274, a spectacle of ultimate conquest. After the parade, however, her fate took a surprising turn. She was not imprisoned or killed, but was granted a luxurious villa in Tibur, modern-day Tivoli. In this gilded cage, the deposed queen began a new, quiet life. She was assimilated, not annihilated. She reportedly married a Roman senator, and her children integrated into the Roman aristocracy. Her lineage did not die in the Syrian desert. It flowed into the bloodstream of the Roman nobility. This was nature's most unexpected resurgence. The legacy of the warrior queen who built an empire to rival Rome found a way to survive, not through war, but through peace, not through rebellion, but through integration. The exclusion zone was for her city, not her bloodline. The radioactive cloud that drifted from Chernobyl respected no borders. It was a silent, invisible invasion that first alerted the world to the catastrophe the Soviet Union was desperately trying to conceal. On April 28, 1986, workers at the Forsmark Nuclear Power Plant in Sweden, over 1,000 kilometers away, detected alarming levels of radiation on their clothing. Their initial fear was a leak at their own facility, but it soon became clear the contamination was airborne, originating from the east. This discovery shattered the wall of Soviet secrecy. As nation after nation across Europe began reporting inexplicable spikes in radiation, international pressure mounted on Moscow to admit the truth. The Chernobyl disaster was no longer a domestic problem. It was a global crisis. The event served as a horrifying wake-up call, exposing the profound inadequacy of existing international oversight for nuclear energy. In the immediate aftermath, the global community, through the International Atomic Energy Agency, scrambled to respond. The incident starkly demonstrated that a nuclear accident anywhere is a potential threat everywhere. This realization catalyzed a paradigm shift in nuclear safety culture. Before Chernobyl, nuclear programs were largely matters of national sovereignty, shrouded in the secrecy characteristic of the Cold War. Afterward, the principles of transparency, international cooperation, and shared responsibility became paramount. The IAEA's role was significantly strengthened, transforming it from a promotional body into a more assertive global safety watchdog. The Convention on Nuclear Safety, adopted in 1994, was a direct consequence of this new era. It legally committed participating states to maintain a high level of safety at their nuclear power plants, subject to a peer review process. The design of the RBMK reactors themselves came under intense international scrutiny, leading to significant safety upgrades across the entire fleet still in operation. Chernobyl forced the world to confront the terrifying reality of nuclear power's potential for continent-spanning devastation, forging a new, albeit fragile, global consensus built on the hard-learned lesson that in the nuclear age, we are all downwind. Beyond the scientific reports and political fallout, the Chernobyl disaster seeped into the very fabric of our global culture, becoming a potent and enduring symbol. It transformed from a specific historical event into a modern myth, a cautionary tale of technological hubris and the catastrophic cost of lies. This cultural processing began almost immediately, finding its voice in the haunting testimonies collected by Nobel laureate Svetlana Alexievich in Voices from Chernobyl. Her work gave a human face to the tragedy, preserving the intimate, harrowing stories of firefighters, liquidators, and displaced residents, ensuring their experiences would not be lost in cold statistics. In cinema, Andrei Tarkovsky's final film, The Sacrifice, released in 1986, captured the profound existential dread of a world living under the nuclear shadow, a sentiment amplified by the disaster. Over the years, Chernobyl became a recurring motif in popular culture, most notably as the eerie post-apocalyptic setting for the video game series Stalker, which introduced a new generation to the zone's haunting beauty and invisible dangers. The zone itself became a character, a place where nature was reclaiming a man-made apocalypse, filled with strange anomalies and mutated creatures, a powerful metaphor for the unpredictable consequences of tampering with nature's fundamental forces. However, it was the 2019 HBO miniseries Chernobyl that brought the story to the forefront of global consciousness with unprecedented force. The series meticulously recreated the timeline of the disaster and its aftermath, exposing the layers of incompetence, denial, and heroism. It wasn't just a historical drama. It was a gripping examination of the nature of truth and the corrosive effect of a political system built on falsehoods. The series sparked a worldwide conversation, driving a surge in tourism to the exclusion zone and renewing interest in the science and history of the event. Through these books, films, and series, Chernobyl lives on not just as a memory, but as a persistent echo, a powerful cultural touchstone that continues to shape our understanding of our relationship with technology, our environment, and our own fallibility. The original sarcophagus, officially named the shelter object, was an act of desperate heroism. Constructed in just 206 days under unimaginable conditions, it was a concrete and steel tomb hastily erected over the smoldering remains of Reactor 4. But it was never intended to be a permanent solution. Built with no foundations and weakened by radiation, its structural integrity was a growing concern for decades. Water seeped through cracks, creating radioactive lava-like flows, and the risk of collapse, which would release another massive plume of radioactive dust, was terrifyingly real. A new, permanent solution was needed, one that would secure the site for generations. The answer was an engineering marvel of staggering proportions: the new Safe Confinement, or NSC. This was not just a project. It was a monumental international undertaking, funded by more than 40 countries. The challenge was immense: how to build a massive containment structure over one of the most radioactive sites on Earth without exposing workers to lethal doses of radiation. The ingenious solution was to construct the colossal arch-shaped shield at a safe distance, and then slide it into place. The scale of the NSC is difficult to comprehend. Taller than the Statue of Liberty and wide enough to house the Colosseum, it is the largest movable land-based structure ever built. Its construction involved pioneering new technologies and robotic systems to perform tasks too dangerous for humans. The structure is a complex system of layers, designed not only to contain the radiation, but also to withstand tornadoes and extreme temperatures. Inside, a giant, remotely operated crane system was installed, which will allow for the future deconstruction of the unstable shelter object and the eventual removal of the nuclear fuel materials within. In November 2016, over a period of several days, the 36,000-ton structure was slowly and meticulously slid over 300 meters into its final position, encasing the decaying sarcophagus. It was a quiet, almost surreal moment of triumph, a testament to human ingenuity and international cooperation, providing a physical shield and a measure of peace for a century to come. Today, the Chernobyl exclusion zone is a place of profound contradictions. It is a scar on the Earth, a 2,600 square kilometer area deemed largely uninhabitable for humans for the next 24,000 years. At its heart lies Pripyat, a ghost city frozen in the amber of 1986. School books lie open on desks, dolls are scattered in empty kindergartens, and the iconic Ferris wheel stands as a silent monument to a life that was abruptly extinguished. This is the human face of the zone, a haunting testament to loss and evacuation. Yet, in the absence of humanity, the zone has become something else entirely, a unique and unintentional wildlife sanctuary. With human activity removed, nature has not just returned, it has flourished in ways unseen elsewhere in Europe. Populations of wolves, bears, lynx, and the endangered Przewalski's horse roam freely through the decaying urban landscape and overgrown forests. This surprising ecological rebirth challenges our understanding of radiation's long-term impact on ecosystems, creating a paradoxical wilderness where the invisible threat of contamination coexists with vibrant life. The zone's future is as complex as its present. It has become a site of intense scientific research, a living laboratory for studying the long-term effects of a nuclear catastrophe. It has also, controversially, become a destination for disaster tourism, with thousands of visitors each year donning dosimeters to walk the empty streets of Pripyat, raising ethical questions about the commercialization of tragedy. The new Safe Confinement has secured the immediate threat of Reactor 4, but the wider area remains a patchwork of radioactive hotspots. The cleanup is a multi-generational task, a burden passed down through time. Chernobyl is more than a place. It is a permanent state of being, a wound on the world that may never fully heal. It stands as a perpetual, sobering reminder of the price of failure, a unique landscape where the past is always present, and nature is slowly, relentlessly reclaiming a world we were forced to abandon.